Hey guys, jumping right in, a new paradigm. It may be that we will have to rethink our old beliefs about which came first, the emotion or the thought. For a while, it may be true that giving a certain belief a great deal of thought will magnify an emotion. Anger, for instance. The thought does not necessarily arrive first on the scene. In the past, our understanding of the way the brain worked reinforced our fantasy that we are in control. Sensory information was routed through the thalamus, the brain's central relay station, and sent directly to the neurocortex, where the incoming signals were assigned meaning, then sent on to the limbic system for an appropriate emotional visceral response. As Atkinson points out, quote, in this tidy, reassuring scenario, emotion is the dutiful servant of the rational brain. Thought proposes, emotion disposes, unquote. While this may be true of the time, it is not true all the time. There are times when a traumatic experience is triggered, for instance, that the information is sent via a back alley directly to the amygdala, the brain's alarm system. Here, the information is scanned for potential danger. If danger is perceived, the body goes into fight or flight mode. Although the same information is simultaneously traveling the longer route from thalamus to neocortex, the back alley approach is faster, producing an instantaneous psychological response, elevated heart rate and blood pressure, and the release of adrenaline and cortisol, as well as the accompanying emotional response. Siegel tells us, quote, the amygdala can rapidly bias the perceptual apparatus towards interpreting the stimuli as dangerous. Non-consciously, the brain is wired, at least with regard to the fear response, to create a self-fulfilling prophecy, unquote, from 1999. This is well documented in my studies of adoptees who frequently seem to operate from a place of fear and do a great deal of self-sabotaging. Quote, if I allow myself to get too close to the person, they will leave me, unquote, thereby making sure that he keeps his distance. Fuck. Apologies, I got interrupted. Alright, where were we? Therefore, making sure that they keep their distance, which in turn makes the other person feel unloved and perplexed by the relationship. Eventually, they give up trying to have more intimacy with them and leave, which then allows them to say, quote, I knew it, unquote. They can fool themselves into believing that it was the closeness that he did allow that made up for the separation so difficult for them, when it was actually the distance they kept that caused the other person to leave in the first place. If a situation can be perceived as fearful, it becomes fearful. Logic or reasoning doesn't seem to play much of a part, and the reaction is often instantaneous. Atkinson says, quote, within milliseconds, we explode with rage or freeze in fear, well before our conscious mind can even grasp what is happening, much less persuade us to take a few deep breaths and maintain our cool. By the time the neocortex gets into the act, the damage has been done. You have already been called your late-to-dinner partner, an inconsiderate jerk, shrieked at your smart-mouthed child, snapped at your critical colleague, or simply shut down, shaking inside in the face of someone else's rage, unquote. He adds that not only are these actions out of control, but due to the flooding of the neocortex by the amygdala-triggered emotional information, its centers for logic and judgment are overwhelmed, making one think that one's actions were entirely accurate and justifiable. Anyone who has ever listened to a batterer explain why they had to hit their wife will understand the last statement. we have a tendency to try to rationalize almost any action on our part, even when a logical part of our brains are shut down by emotional flooding. Okay, that is the end of A New Paradigm. Here are my commentary, right? So, while you're absolutely valid in your emotions, it's that reaction, right, that we have to fight, that fight or flight, that freeze or things, right? So even if your partner is upsetting you, for example, right, because we all know that in relationships nothing is perfect, right, that there's no excuse to then hit that other person, right? Doesn't matter how bad they're being. And like I said, there's a level of self-defense, and I'm not talking about those instances. There is no excuse to then harm someone else, right? And unfortunately, I've heard a few people rationalize that because they went through trauma, that because, they're not able to express themselves in a different way, that, it's okay, but it's not. And then they still, we would call it victim blaming, right? They would then blame the person that they were aimed towards, even though that other person may be in the wrong. That doesn't mean that they deserve to be hit, for example. And it's it's frustrating to hear, but it's also hard to go through yourself, right? So when they were talking about, when the author was talking about the self-sabotaging rationalization, right? Hey, I've been there, done that. Working through that, right? As I said in my last video about, or was it last two videos? No, I think it was the last video about my biological father, right? I had this fear that if I were to have a level of success, that he would then come find me and claim that, oh, well, I'm her, biological father, it's because of me, kind of thing, right? More towards my dad than to my mom, my biological mom, but a little bit of fear on that. And so, like, even though I was doing well, I would suddenly not do well. And it becomes a vicious cycle, right, that we have to get out of. And I'm gonna admit, like, even though I'm still working through it, I still have my moments. But being aware and understanding what the responses are and what the symptoms of those, like fight versus flight, fawn, and there's another one I can't think of off the top of my head. Knowing what the symptoms are, which is what I was talking about with the fogged adoptees, they don't recognize those responses and how they're just immediately triggered because of the trauma, right? They may equate it to something else, but they're not, I don't know if psychoanalyzing is the proper word in this manner, but they're not, like, taking that into account. Anyway, I hope you all have a terrific day, and I will see you guys tomorrow for emotional dysregulation.